Welcome to Café Tales. I'm Allie, your host for today's mystery. Today, we're joining the brilliant Belgian detective Hercule Poirot in The Last Will of Margaret Rains. This is a tale of hidden identities, long-buried family secrets, and a decades-old crime finally coming to light. Before we begin, I'd love to know where in the world you're tuning in from today. Let me know in the comments. Grab your favorite beverage, perhaps a tisane as Poirot might enjoy, and let's dive into this mystery, narrated by his faithful friend, Captain Hastings. Chapter 1. The Summons from Surrey Hercule Poirot and the Last Will of Margaret Rains. It was a brisk autumn morning when I returned to London after 6 months attending to my affairs in Argentina. The city welcomed me with its familiar gray skies and bustling streets, a comforting contrast to the expansive pampas I'd left behind. My first order of business, naturally, was to call upon my old friend Poirot. I found him in his meticulously kept flat on Whitehaven Mansions, arranging a collection of silver curios with mathematical precision on his mantelpiece. "Hastings!" he exclaimed, his face lighting up beneath his magnificent mustache. "You return to us at last, mon ami." He grasped both my hands in his. "You are well, yes?" "Quite well, Poirot," I replied, settling into the chair he indicated, positioned, as always, at a perfect right angle to the fireplace. "Argentina has been good to me, but I've missed London. And your cases, of course." Poirot's eyes twinkled. "Ah, the great detective's adventures. They captivate you still. Perhaps it is fortunate, then, that you arrived today of all days." He crossed to his desk and retrieved an envelope, handing it to me with a flourish. The heavy cream paper bore an official-looking letterhead, Weatherby, Harrington and Sons, Solicitors. "This arrived this morning," Poirot explained. "It seems the little gray cells are once again required." I scanned the letter quickly. "Dear Mr. Poirot, I write on a matter of some urgency concerning the estate of the late Margaret Rains of Oakenhurst, Surrey. Circumstances surrounding her passing 2 days ago have raised concerns that I am not at liberty to detail in this correspondence. Your reputation for discretion and brilliance has led me to seek your counsel before proceeding with certain legal matters. I would be most grateful if you could call at your earliest convenience. Yours sincerely, Edward Weatherby, Esquire." "Margaret Rains," I mused, returning the letter. "The name sounds vaguely familiar." "Indeed," said Poirot, carefully adjusting his bow tie in the mirror. "The Rains family, old money, very respectable. Margaret was the widow of Sir William. Rains, the industrialist, no children, as I recall. And now she has died, has she? Natural causes?" Poirot raised an eyebrow. "That, mon ami Hastings, is perhaps what we are being asked to determine." A familiar spark of excitement kindled within me. "You're going to take the case, then?" "But of course. And you, my friend, will accompany me." His eyes met mine in the mirror, questioning but hopeful. I laughed. "As if I could refuse. When do we leave?" "Mr. Weatherby expects us at 2 o'clock. Poirot glanced at his pocket watch. "We have time for lunch at that little restaurant you favor before we meet him." As we dined, Poirot filled me in on what little he knew of Margaret Rains, a philanthropist, in her later years respected in society circles and possessed of a considerable fortune with no direct heirs. By the time we arrived at the offices of Weatherby, Harrington and Sons, my curiosity was thoroughly piqued. The solicitor's office was exactly as one might expect. Leather-bound volumes lining the walls, heavy oak furniture, and the subtle smell of furniture polish and important papers. Edward Weatherby himself proved to be a thin, nervous man of about 50, with wire-rimmed spectacles and prematurely gray hair, Mr. Poirot, Captain Hastings. Thank you for coming so promptly, he said, ushering us into leather chairs and offering us tea, which Poirot declined with a small wave of his hand. The matter at hand, if you please, Mr. Weatherby, Poirot prompted. The solicitor clasped his hands together. Yes, quite right. Well, the situation is this. Mrs. Margaret Raines, a client of mine for over 20 years, passed away 2 nights ago at her home, Oakenhurst. According to her physician, Dr. Henderson, she died peacefully in her sleep. You have reason to doubt this assessment? Poirot asked. Weatherby hesitated. Not precisely, no. Dr. Henderson is highly respected, but there are circumstances. Elucidate, if you please. 3 days ago, the day before her death, Mrs. Raines summoned me to Oakenhurst. She wished to make changes to her will. Weatherby removed his glasses and polished them nervously. This was not unusual in itself. She reviewed her arrangements periodically. However, this time she informed me and subsequently announced to her household that she had decided to name a new primary beneficiary. I leaned forward. Someone unexpected? Most unexpected. She refused to reveal the name to anyone, including myself, saying only that justice would finally be done, and that she would provide me with the necessary details the following day. He replaced his glasses. That meeting never took place. She was found dead in her bed the next morning. Poirot's eyes narrowed. And the existing will? Who benefits? Various charitable institutions receive the bulk, with modest bequests to her household staff and companions. A distant cousin, Miss Judith Raines, would inherit Oakenhurst itself. And the new will, it was not completed? That's just it, Mr. Poirot. Mrs. Raines claimed she had written her wishes in full and would provide them to me, but no such document has been found, despite a thorough search of her room. Poirot nodded slowly. So we have a wealthy woman who announces a significant change to her testamentary intentions, and then conveniently dies before these changes can be formalized. Most interesting. He tapped his fingertips together. You suspect foul play, Mr. Weatherby? The solicitor shifted uncomfortably. I wouldn't go that far. It's just, Mrs. Raines was in excellent health for a woman of 75. Dr. Henderson had commented on it during her last checkup just a week earlier. And there's something else. He lowered his voice. Mrs. Lacey, the housekeeper, mentioned to me that Mrs. Raines had been unusually agitated the evening before her death. She overheard raised voices coming from the study. Mrs. Raines and Miss Porter, her companion. What was the nature of this disagreement? I asked. Mrs. Lacey couldn't say exactly, but she did hear Mrs. Raines mention the boy several times. Weatherby frowned. I know of no boy connected with the household. Poirot leaned back, his fingertips forming a perfect pyramid. When may we visit Oakenhurst, Mr. Weatherby? I've already made arrangements. The staff expects you this evening, if that suits. I've told them you're there to assist me with matters relating to the estate. Très bien. We shall depart immediately. Poirot rose. One final question, if you please. This change of beneficiary, was it truly unexpected? Had Mrs. Raines given no previous indication of such intentions? Weatherby hesitated. There was something. 2 months ago, Mrs. Raines asked me about the legal process for adoption, specifically the adoption of an adult. I provided the information, but she never mentioned it again. I see, said Poirot, his eyes gleaming with that familiar look I knew so well. The look of a hunter who has caught the first scent of his prey. Most illuminating. As our taxi carried us toward the train station, I contemplated the curious circumstances unfolding before us. A wealthy widow, a mysterious new heir, sudden death, and a missing will. It had all the elements of the complex puzzles Poirot so loved to unravel. "What do you make of it, Poirot?" I asked as our taxi navigated through London's crowded streets. He adjusted his hat meticulously. "It is too soon for theories, mon ami. But already I observe the interesting fact. Someone did not wish the new will to be executed. The identity of this someone, and whether they were prepared to commit murder to prevent it, that is what we must discover." I gazed out at the passing scenery as we left London behind, the grey buildings giving way to the green countryside of Surrey. Ahead lay Oakenhurst and its secrets, waiting to be unraveled by the little grey cells of my remarkable friend. Chapter 2. Shadows at Oakenhurst revealed itself gradually as our taxi wound up the long gravel drive. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the manicured lawns, giving the manor house an air of melancholy splendor. Built in the Queen Anne style, the red brick facade was softened by climbing ivy that had worked its way up to the second-floor windows. It was precisely the sort of grand English country home that had seen generations of family drama unfold beneath its roof. "Most impressive, is it not, Hastings?" remarked Poirot as we approached. "Such houses, they are like living creatures with their own secrets." "It certainly looks like the sort of place that would have secrets," I agreed, noting the way the setting sun reflected off the numerous windows like watchful eyes. A solemn-faced butler received us at the door. "Mr. Poirot and Captain Hastings, I presume? Mr. Weatherby telephoned to inform us of your arrival. I am Perkins, the butler. Please follow me." He led us through a high-ceilinged entrance hall adorned with hunting trophies and family portraits into a drawing room where a small group awaited us. The atmosphere was tense, like a theater before the curtain rises. "Allow me to present our guests," Perkins intoned. "Mr. Hercule Poirot and Captain Hastings." A tall, distinguished gentleman with a military bearing was the first to step forward. "Colonel Robert Burrows," he introduced himself with a curt nod. "Old friend of the family. Served with Sir William in the Boer War. Dreadful business, all this." "Miss Judith Raines," announced a woman of perhaps 40, dressed in an expensive but understated black dress. I recognized in her strong jaw and patrician nose a resemblance to the Raines family portraits in the hall. "Margaret's second cousin, once removed. I've been staying here since receiving news of her passing." The next introduction came from a small bird-like woman with sharp features and anxious eyes. "Evelyn Porter," she said quietly. "I was Mrs. Raines's companion for 23 years. Something in her manner struck me as particularly nervous, even allowing for the circumstances. "Dr. James Henderson," said a stout, gray-haired man with a reassuring bedside manner. "I was Margaret's physician for the last decade of her life. A remarkable woman." "Mrs. Lacey, the housekeeper," Perkins concluded, indicating a matronly woman hovering near the doorway, who bobbed a small curtsy. Poirot bowed slightly to the assembly. "It is a pleasure to make your acquaintance, though I regret the circumstances. Naturally, Mr. Weatherby has asked me to assist with certain matters concerning Mrs. Raines's estate." "Quite unnecessary, if you ask me," Colonel Burrows harumphed. "Margaret's affairs were always in perfect order. Don't see what a detective has to do with it." "You are well informed as to my profession, Colonel," Poirot observed mildly. "Everyone knows who you are, Mr. Poirot," said Miss Raines with a thin smile. "Though I must say I share the Colonel's confusion about why you're here." "Perhaps," Dr. Henderson suggested, Mr. Weatherby wishes to ensure that everything is handled with the utmost propriety, given the unusual circumstances preceding Margaret's death. Miss Porter's hand trembled slightly as she set down her teacup. You refer to Margaret's announcement about changing her will? Indeed, said Poirot. I understand this came as something of a surprise to the household. That's putting it mildly, Colonel Burroughs said with a short laugh. Threw a bombshell in the middle of dinner, she did. After all these years of supporting her various charities, suddenly there's some mystery air none of us have ever heard of. Did Mrs. Raines offer any explanation for this change of heart? I asked. 5 pairs of eyes exchanged glances. Only that justice would finally be done, Miss Raines replied. Terribly dramatic. Margaret always did have a flair for the theatrical. She seemed different that night, Miss Porter said softly. Almost feverish with excitement. I was concerned for her health. Her health was excellent, Dr. Henderson interjected firmly. I had examined her just the week before, strong as an ox for a woman her age. That's partly why her sudden passing was so unexpected. And yet, Poirot mused, healthy people, they too must die, n'est-ce pas? Tell me, doctor, what was the cause of death? Henderson shifted uncomfortably. Natural causes, Mr. Poirot. Heart failure in her sleep. Not uncommon at her age, despite her general good health. I see, said Poirot. And the room where Mrs. Raines died, it has been kept undisturbed? Certainly not, Miss Raines responded, sounding mildly scandalized. This is a home, Mr. Poirot, not a museum. The room has been cleaned, of course, though Margaret's personal effects remain untouched, awaiting Mr. Weatherby's instructions. Perhaps, Poirot suggested, Captain Hastings and I might see this room. It would help us to form a picture of the late Mrs. Raines. Of course, said Miss Porter, rising quickly. I'll show you up myself. As we followed her up the broad staircase, I noticed how the portraits of stern-faced Raines ancestors seemed to watch our progress with disapproval. Miss Porter led us down a long corridor to a set of double doors at the end. This was Margaret's suite, she explained, pushing the doors open. The room beyond was spacious and elegant, dominated by a large 4-poster bed draped in burgundy silk. French windows opened onto a small balcony overlooking the gardens. A writing desk stood in one corner, its surface bare except for a silver inkwell and blotter. Everything is just as she left it? Poirot inquired, his eyes scanning the room. Well, the bed has been made up fresh, naturally, and the room aired, Miss Porter replied. But otherwise, yes. Her clothing is still in the wardrobe, her books on the shelves, her papers in the desk. Her papers? Poirot's ears perked up. Would these include the new will she mentioned? Miss Porter shook her head. We've looked everywhere. Mr. Weatherby conducted a thorough search the day after. After we found her. There was no sign of any new document. Poirot wandered to the writing desk, running a finger along its polished surface. And this is where Mrs. Raines would write her correspondence? Yes. She was very particular about her. Letters wrote them longhand even in this age of telephones. I understand there was some disagreement between you and Mrs. Raines the evening before her death, Poirot said casually, examining a small silver paperweight. Miss Porter's face flushed. Who told you that? Mrs. Lacey, I suppose, with her? Ears always flapping. She composed herself with visible effort. It was nothing, really. A small difference of opinion about household matters. Not concerning the boy, then? Poirot asked innocently. The color drained from Miss Porter's face. I don't know what you mean. Before Poirot could pursue this line of questioning, We were interrupted by the sound of raised voices from downstairs. Moving quickly to the hallway, we encountered Mrs. Lacey bustling up the stairs. "Oh, Mr. Poirot, sir. There's a gentleman arrived. Says he has an appointment with Mrs. Raines." When Perkins told him the poor lady had passed, he became most distressed. "Colonel Burrows is trying to calm him down, but—" We followed her downstairs to find the drawing room in a state of some disorder. A young man, perhaps in his early 20s, stood in the center of the room, his face pale with shock. Colonel Burrows had a restraining hand on his arm. "This is most irregular," the colonel was saying. "You can't simply barge in here making claims." "I'm not making claims," the young man protested. "I had a letter from Mrs. Raines asking me to call on her today. She said it was a matter of great importance." "Mr. Poirot," Miss Raines cut in sharply when she saw us enter. "Perhaps you might help us with this situation. This young man claims to have had correspondence with my cousin, yet none of us have ever heard of him." The young man turned to us, his expression a mixture of confusion and distress. "My name is Thomas Grant," he said, "and I don't understand what's happening here." I observed Poirot's eyes light up with that particular gleam that meant a piece of the puzzle had just fallen into place. He stepped forward with a courteous bow. "Enchanté, Mr. Grant. Perhaps you would be so good as to tell us the nature of your acquaintance with the late Mrs. Raines." As Thomas Grant prepared to speak, I noticed Miss Porter slip quietly from the room, her face a mask of barely concealed alarm. Outside, the sun had set completely, and the shadows of Oakenhurst seemed to deepen, concealing secrets that were only beginning to emerge. Chapter 3. A Tapestry of Deception. The arrival of Thomas Grant threw Oakenhurst into a state of barely concealed turmoil. The young man, now seated in an armchair by the fire, appeared overwhelmed by the situation he had unwittingly entered. He was of medium height, with an earnest face, neatly dressed in a manner that suggested careful attention to appearance rather than wealth. "I received this letter a week ago," he explained, producing an envelope from his inside pocket. He handed it to Poirot with a bewildered expression. "I'd never met Mrs. Raines before, not that I was aware of, at least." Poirot examined the letter carefully. The heavy cream stationery matched what I had seen of Margaret Raines's writing desk. He read aloud, "Dear Mr. Grant, circumstances have come to my attention which necessitate our meeting. I would be most grateful if you would call at Oakenhurst on the 15th at 3 Narrated. The matter concerns your future and is, I assure you, of the utmost importance to us both. Yours sincerely, Margaret Raines." "Most interesting," Poirot murmured, returning the letter. "To Grant. And you had no prior knowledge of Mrs. Raines or her interest in you?" "None whatsoever," Grant replied firmly. "I assumed it might be connected to the orphanage, St. Mary's, where I was raised. Mrs. Raines might have been a benefactor." Colonel Burrows gave a derisive snort. "Convenient story. For all we know, he could have forged that letter himself." "That is most unjust, Colonel," Poirot said mildly. "The handwriting appears consistent with the letter Mr. Weatherby showed us. And what purpose would such a forgery serve? Mr. Grant clearly did not know of Mrs. Raines's death until his arrival." "Well, I find the timing suspicious," Miss Raines interjected coldly. "My cousin announces a change to her will, then dies before it can be formalized. And suddenly this young man appears, claiming to have been summoned by her." Thomas Grant flushed. "I'm not claiming anything beyond what—" "I've told you, I received a letter. I came as requested. I had no idea Mrs. Raines had died, nor that there was any question of a will." Dr. Henderson, who had been quietly observing the exchange, cleared his throat. Perhaps we're getting ahead of ourselves. The young man appears to be telling the truth as he knows it. The more pressing question is why Margaret would have summoned him. All eyes turned to Poirot, who had been surveying the room with his characteristic meticulous attention. Précisément, he agreed. And to answer this, we must begin at the beginning. Mr. Grant, if you would be so good as to tell us something of your background. Thomas Grant shifted uncomfortably. There's not much to tell. I was left at St. Mary's Orphanage as an infant. No one knew who my parents were. I grew up there, received a decent education thanks to some anonymous benefactors, and now work as a clerk at Barrington's publishing house in London. Anonymous benefactors? Colonel Burroughs repeated skeptically. How convenient. It's quite common for orphanages to have such arrangements, Dr. Henderson noted. Many people prefer to give charitably without public recognition. Poirot's eyes narrowed slightly. Mr. Grant, did you serve in the war? Yes, sir. Royal Fusiliers. I was wounded at Passchendaele and spent 6 months in a hospital in France before being sent home in 18. A flash of something, recognition perhaps, crossed Colonel Burroughs's face, but it was quickly suppressed. We shall need to verify all this, of course, Poirot continued smoothly. In the meantime, perhaps it would be best if Mr. Grant remained at Oakenhurst. The hour grows late and there is much still to discuss. Miss Raines frowned. I hardly think I must insist, Poirot said firmly. If Mr. Grant is indeed the person Mrs. Raines intended to name in her new will, his presence here is most pertinent. Of course he must stay, agreed Dr. Henderson. Whatever Margaret's intentions, the young man deserves answers as much as any of us. Miss Porter, who had slipped back into the room during the conversation, spoke up unexpectedly. The blue room in the East Wing is prepared. I'll show Mr. Grant up myself. As they left, Poirot turned to the remaining company. Now, if you please, I should like to speak with each of you individually. Dr. Henderson, perhaps you would be so kind as to begin. The others dispersed, leaving us alone with the doctor, who settled back in his chair with a resigned expression. I suppose you want to know more about Margaret's health, he began. If you would be so good, Poirot replied. Dr. Henderson sighed. As I said earlier, she was in remarkable condition for her age. Heart, lungs, digestion, all functioning splendidly. She took a daily constitutional around the grounds regardless of weather, mentally sharp as a tack. And yet she died of heart failure? I interjected. The doctor shifted uncomfortably. That was my initial assessment, yes. The symptoms were consistent. She appeared to have died peacefully in her sleep. But I confess, given the circumstances, I've had doubts. What kind of doubts, doctor? Nothing concrete, just a feeling. I've seen many natural deaths in my career, and this one troubled me. There was a certain blueness to her lips and fingertips that seemed excessive, even allowing for post-mortem lividity. Did you consider the possibility of poison? Poirot asked bluntly. Henderson looked shocked. Poison? Good heavens, no. I mean, I suppose it's possible, but what reason would I have had to suspect such a thing at the time? None, perhaps, Poirot conceded. But now, with the questions surrounding the will, you're suggesting murder, the doctor said flatly. It's a serious accusation, Mr. Poirot. It is not an accusation, merely a possibility to be explored, Poirot replied. Tell me, is there any way to determine now if Mrs. Raines was poisoned? Henderson hesitated. An autopsy could be performed, though the family might object. And of course, the time elapsed since death would make certain tests less conclusive. I see, said Poirot thoughtfully. One more question, if you please. On the day of Mrs. Raines's death, did you observe anything unusual in the household? Any guest or delivery that was out of the ordinary? The doctor thought for a moment. Nothing comes to mind. It was a quiet day. I believe Miss Porter mentioned that Margaret had been working in her study all morning, then took a tray in her room for lunch. She didn't come down for dinner, saying she had a slight headache and wished to retire early. And who took this tray to her room? I couldn't say. One of the maids, I suppose. Or perhaps Mrs. Lacey. Thank you, Doctor, Poirot said. You have been most helpful. After Dr. Henderson left, I turned to Poirot. What do you make of it all? It is too soon to form theories, Hastings, but already I observe that this house holds many secrets. He tapped his fingers against his chin. I think tomorrow we must examine Mrs. Raines's study more thoroughly. If there was a new will, it must be somewhere. And what about this Thomas Grant? Do you believe his story? For the moment, yes. His surprise appeared genuine. But there is more to his connection with Mrs. Raines than he knows. Of that I am certain. Our conversation was interrupted by the return of Miss Porter, who paused in the doorway. Mr. Grant is settled in the blue room, she announced. Dinner will be served in half an hour, if that suits. Perfectly, said Poirot. But before that, Miss Porter, I should like a word with you in private. The woman's composure faltered momentarily. Of course, she replied, her fingers nervously adjusting the brooch at her collar. Shall we use the morning room? It's more private. As we followed her through the house, I observed her rigid posture and the slight tremor in her hands. Whatever Miss Porter knew about Margaret Raines and Thomas Grant, it clearly disturbed her greatly, and I had no doubt that Poirot had every intention of uncovering her secret before the night was through. Chapter 4. The Correspondence Conundrum. The morning room at Oakenhurst proved to be a small but elegant chamber with French windows overlooking a rose garden that would have been quite splendid in the proper season. Now, in late autumn, it presented a rather melancholy aspect, with bare stems awaiting the pruning shears. Miss Porter perched on the edge of an armchair, her hands folded tightly in her lap. There was something bird-like about her, not merely her slight frame, but the quick, nervous movements of her head as she glanced between Poirot and myself. You wish to speak with me, Mr. Poirot? She asked, her voice carefully controlled. Oui, mademoiselle. I should like to discuss your disagreement with Mrs. Raines on the evening before her death. The disagreement concerning the boy? Miss Porter's fingers tightened visibly. It was nothing of consequence. And yet Mrs. Lacey reports that voices were raised. That suggests a matter of some importance, does it not? She hesitated, her eyes darting briefly toward the window. Margaret, Mrs. Raines, had become fixated on certain charitable endeavors in recent months. I merely expressed concern that she was perhaps being taken advantage of. And this boy that was mentioned, might this have been Mr. Thomas Grant? A slight flush crept into Miss Porter's pale cheeks. I really couldn't say. Mrs. Raines received many letters requesting assistance. She was known for her generosity. Come now, Miss Porter, said Poirot gently. You were Mrs. Raines's companion for over 20 years. Surely she confided in you? For a moment I thought she might break down, but with visible effort she composed herself. Mrs. Raines was a very private person, Mr. Poirot. There were aspects of her life about which she spoke to no one, not even me. And yet you knew of her intention to change her will? only what she announced to the entire household that evening, at dinner. It came as a complete shock to me, I assure you. Poirot regarded her thoughtfully. I should like to see Mrs. Raines's study, if I may. Miss Porter seemed relieved at the change of subject. Of course, if you'll follow me. Margaret Raines's study was situated in the east wing, a handsomely appointed room lined with bookshelves and dominated by a large mahogany desk positioned before windows that would catch the morning sun. The desk was meticulously organized, with writing implements arranged with military precision and several stacks of correspondence placed in neat piles. Madame was most orderly, I see, observed Poirot with evident approval. Oh, yes, Miss Porter replied. She was most particular about her belongings. Everything had its place. Poirot began to circle the room slowly, his eyes taking in every detail. And these papers, they haven't been disturbed since her death? Only by Mr. Weatherby when he was searching for the new will. He was most careful to replace everything exactly as he found it. Poirot nodded, approaching the desk. With your permission, he murmured, beginning to examine the papers with delicate precision. Most appeared to be routine correspondence. Invitations, acknowledgments of charitable donations, business matters related to various investments. Nothing that seemed immediately revelatory. Mrs. Porter, I ventured, would you happen to know if Mrs. Raines kept a diary or a personal journal of any kind? A flicker of something, alarm, crossed her features before she composed herself. Not that I am aware of, Captain Hastings. And yet, said Poirot mildly, not looking up from his examination, a lady so meticulous, so organized, it would be most unusual if she did not record her thoughts somewhere, n'est-ce pas? I really couldn't say, Mr. Poirot. Poirot had moved to one of the bookshelves and was examining the volumes with his characteristic thoroughness. Mrs. Raines was an educated woman, I perceive. Many works in French, in German. Ah, and here. He drew out a slim volume. Poetry of Tennyson. A favorite, perhaps? A slight tremor passed over Miss Porter's face. Yes, she was particularly fond of Tennyson. Poirot opened the volume carefully, thumbing through its pages. I noticed his fingers pause momentarily before he closed the book and replaced it on the shelf. Would you be so kind as to show me Mrs. Raines's bedroom once more? He asked. There are one or two details I should like to observe in the daylight. Miss Porter led us back to the bedroom we had visited earlier. In the morning light, it presented a different aspect, less somber, more revealing of the personality of its former occupant. Like the study, it was meticulously arranged, with a small writing desk positioned near the window. Poirot moved directly to the bedside table, where a small collection of books was arranged. Mrs. Raines enjoyed reading before retiring for the night? Yes, it was her custom to read for an hour before sleep. Poirot examined the volumes carefully, then moved methodically around the room, his eyes missing nothing. He paused before a small rosewood box on the dressing table. This is a jewelry case? Yes. Mrs. Raines kept her everyday pieces there. Her valuable jewelry is in the safe downstairs. And did she possess many valuable pieces? Miss Porter's hands twisted together. Several, including a rather remarkable ruby necklace that had belonged to Sir William's mother. It was something of a family heirloom. I should like to see this safe, if I may. Miss Porter led us to a small anteroom adjoining the library, where a substantial wall safe was concealed behind a landscape painting. Do you know the combination, mademoiselle? Poirot inquired. No, only Mr. Weatherby has that. Mrs. Raines was most particular about her valuables, Then we shall consult with Mr. Weatherby when he returns, Poirot said, turning away from the safe. Now, perhaps we might speak with Colonel Burrows. We found the colonel in the billiards room, idly practicing shots with a studied casualness that did not quite conceal his agitation. "Ah, Monsieur Poirot," he said, straightening up as we entered. "Come to interrogate me, have you?" "Merely to converse, Colonel," Poirot replied smoothly. "Miss Porter, you need not remain." She hesitated briefly, then nodded and withdrew, closing the door behind her. "Now then, Colonel," Poirot began once we were alone, "perhaps you would be so good as to tell me of your relationship with the late Mrs. Raines." The colonel chalked his cue with deliberate movements. "Knew her husband in the service. Fine man, William. After he passed, I made it a point to look in on Margaret from time to time. Duty to an old comrade, you understand." "Most commendable," murmured Poirot. "And you were present when Mrs. Raines announced her intention to change her will?" The colonel's expression darkened. "I was. Damned odd business, if you ask me. Margaret was always most proper about her affairs. To suddenly announce she was changing everything in favor of some unknown heir, most unlike her. Did she provide any explanation for this decision? None whatsoever. Simply announced at dinner that she had made a discovery that necessitated changes to her will. Said she'd be meeting with Weatherby the next day to formalize matters. He lined up a shot and executed it with unnecessary force. Then she was dead. Damned coincidence." "You do not believe it was a coincidence, Colonel?" Poirot inquired mildly. The colonel's eyes narrowed. "I didn't say that." He hesitated. "Look here, Poirot. I'm a straightforward man. I don't deal in insinuations. If you're suggesting foul play—" "I suggest nothing, Colonel. I merely observe and inquire." Poirot's tone was mild, but his eyes were sharp. "Tell me, what is your opinion of Mr. Thomas Grant?" "Never set eyes on the fellow before today," the colonel replied brusquely. "Can't imagine what connection he might have had to Margaret. And yet his arrival seems most fortuitous, does it not? A young man appears, claiming to have been summoned by Mrs. Raines, shortly after she announces her intention to change her will." The colonel's grip tightened. On his cue. "If you're suggesting the boy had something to do with Margaret's death—" "I suggest nothing, Colonel," Poirot interrupted smoothly. "I merely collect the facts. Tell me, were you aware that Mrs. Raines had been making inquiries about adoption procedures?" For a moment, the colonel appeared genuinely startled. "Adoption? At her age? Preposterous." "Perhaps not for herself," Poirot suggested. "Perhaps for someone else." The colonel's brow furrowed. "What are you driving at, Poirot?" But Poirot merely smiled enigmatically. "I understand that Miss Judith Raines is a distant cousin of the deceased. Second cousin once removed, or some such thing," the colonel replied, visibly relieved at the change of subject. "Never had much to do with the family until recently. Showed up about 6 months ago saying she wanted to reconnect with her roots. Margaret was always one for family ties, took the girl in immediately." "And what is your impression of Miss Raines?" The colonel hesitated. "Seems decent enough. Quiet sort. Keeps to herself mostly." He paused. "Though, between ourselves, I've wondered if she might not have had expectations regarding Margaret's estate. Can't have been pleased by that announcement at dinner." Poirot nodded thoughtfully. "I should like to speak with her next, if you would be so kind as to direct me." "Try the conservatory," the colonel suggested. "She spends a good deal of time among the plants." We thanked him and took our leave. As we made our way through the house, I could contain my curiosity no longer. "What was it you noticed in Mrs. Raines's copy of Tennyson, Poirot?" I asked in a low voice. A small smile played about his lips. "Ah, mon ami, you do not miss everything after all. It was most interesting. Several pages showed signs of being read frequently, and in one particular poem, certain lines were underlined." "Which poem?" "Most significant, I think. The tale of a man presumed dead who returns to find his wife remarried. And now, Hastings," he continued, "let us see what Miss Judith Raines can tell us about her late cousin's intentions." As we approached the conservatory, the glass-paneled doors were suddenly flung open, and Mrs. Lacey emerged in evident distress. "Oh, Mr. Poirot!" she exclaimed, her hand flying to her throat. "You must come quickly. Miss Porter, in the garden, I fear something terrible has happened." Without waiting for a reply, she turned and hurried back the way she had come. Poirot and I exchanged a glance before hastening after her through the conservatory and out into the garden beyond. Chapter 5. Benevolence Unveiled. We hurried through the conservatory and out into the garden, following Mrs. Lacey's rapid steps. The garden, once immaculately maintained, now bore the melancholy aspect of late autumn. Beds cleared for winter, roses cut back, and a scattering of fallen leaves that had escaped the gardener's rake. Mrs. Lacey led us to a small ornamental pond surrounded by stone benches. There, slumped on one of the benches, was Miss Porter. Her face was ashen, her breathing shallow, and beside her lay a small silver teacup, tipped on its side with a few drops of liquid still visible on its rim. Poirot knelt beside her immediately, examining her without touching. "When did you find her?" he asked sharply. "Just minutes ago," Mrs. Lacey replied, wringing her hands. "I came to ask if she'd like tea in the conservatory and found her like this. I've sent Perkins for Dr. Henderson." "Très bien. Hastings, remain with Miss Porter. Do not move her or touch anything. Mrs. Lacey, kindly return to the house and ensure that everyone remains in the drawing room until I join you." As they departed in opposite directions, I kept watch over the unconscious woman. Her breathing seemed labored, and an alarming bluish tinge colored her lips, the same symptom Dr. Henderson had noted about Margaret Raines. Within minutes, Poirot returned with Dr. Henderson, who immediately began examining Miss Porter. "Rapid and thready," he muttered, opening her eyelid to check her pupils. "Respiration shallow. Similar symptoms to—" He caught himself glancing meaningfully at Poirot. "To Mrs. Raines?" Poirot finished for him. "Hastings, please assist the doctor in getting Miss Porter to her room. I shall examine the scene more closely." As we carefully lifted Miss Porter, Poirot knelt by the bench, producing a small magnifying glass from his pocket. With meticulous care, he examined the teacup, then the ground around the bench. I noticed him collect something tiny between his finger and thumb, placing it in his handkerchief before folding it carefully away. Once Miss Porter had been settled in her room with Dr. Henderson attending to her, Poirot and I made our way to the drawing room, where the household had assembled. An atmosphere of tense expectation greeted our entrance. "What's happened to Miss Porter?" demanded Colonel Burrows. "Mrs. Lacey says she's been taken ill." "Most seriously ill," Poirot confirmed gravely. "Dr. Henderson is with her now." "Will she recover?" Judith Raines asked, her voice betraying more curiosity than concern. "That remains to be seen, mademoiselle," Poirot replied. "Tell me, who was the last person to see Miss Porter before she was found in the garden?" The group exchanged glances. "I believe I was," said Thomas Grant unexpectedly. "I encountered her. in the corridor after speaking with Mr. Weatherby, who arrived about an hour ago. She mentioned wanting fresh air and was heading toward the conservatory. And what time was this, Mr. Grant? Approximately 2:45, I should think. Did Miss Porter appear distressed or anxious in any way? Grant considered this. Not particularly, though she seemed preoccupied. She barely acknowledged me as we passed. Mr. Weatherby. Poirot turned to the solicitor, who had been sitting quietly in the corner. You arrived at Oakenhurst this afternoon. Yes, around 2:00, Weatherby confirmed. I had some estate matters to discuss and brought the documents I mentioned, the ones regarding Mrs. Raines's inquiries about adoption procedures. And did you speak with Miss Porter? Briefly, in passing. She directed me to the library where I could work undisturbed. Poirot nodded thoughtfully. Ladies and gentlemen, it appears that Miss Porter has been poisoned. A collective gasp rippled through the room. Poisoned, echoed Miss Raines. But that would mean, Poirot continued firmly, that we are dealing not with one tragedy, but two. I believe Mrs. Raines's death was no accident of nature, but deliberate murder. The tension in the room was palpable. Colonel Burroughs's face had darkened with anger, while Mrs. Lacey pressed a handkerchief to her mouth in horror. Thomas Grant sat perfectly still, his expression unreadable. I must ask each of you to remain at Oakenhurst, Poirot announced. No one is to leave without my express permission. Hastings and I shall be departing shortly on a matter of investigation, but we shall return by evening. This is preposterous, Colonel Burroughs protested. You have no authority to restrict our movements. Perhaps not legally, Colonel, Poirot replied calmly. But if you wish to see justice done for Mrs. Raines, you will cooperate. I have already telephoned Inspector Japp of Scotland Yard. He will be arriving tomorrow morning. This pronouncement had its desired effect. Even the colonel subsided, though with evident reluctance. We left the drawing room, and Poirot headed directly to Mrs. Raines's study, where Mr. Weatherby had left a slim folder on the desk. The adoption inquiries, Weatherby explained as Poirot opened it. As you can see, Mrs. Raines was investigating the legalities of adult adoption. Most unusual at her age. Poirot scanned the documents quickly. And did Mrs. Raines explain her interest in this matter? Not explicitly, no. She merely said it was a hypothetical inquiry at first, then later admitted it concerned a personal matter she was not yet ready to disclose. Tell me, Mr. Weatherby, did Mrs. Raines ever mention a connection to St. Mary's Orphanage? Weatherby's eyebrows rose in surprise. Why, yes. She made regular donations there for years. How did you... Mr. Grant mentioned he was raised... There, I explained. Indeed, said Poirot. And now, Mr. Weatherby, I should like to see the contents of Mrs. Raines's safe, if you please. The solicitor led us back to the anteroom where the wall safe was concealed. With practiced movements, he dialed the combination and swung open the heavy door. Inside were several jewel cases, a stack of documents, and a small leather-bound book. Is this everything? Poirot asked, his eyes fixed on the contents. As far as I'm aware, Weatherby replied. I haven't had occasion to inventory the safe's contents since Mrs. Raines's death. Poirot carefully removed the leather-bound book, which proved to be a personal diary. He leafed through it briefly, nodding to himself as if confirming a suspicion. Mr. Weatherby, we must leave for London immediately. There is information we need to verify at St. Mary's Orphanage. I should be most grateful if you would keep this diary secure until our return. Of course, the solicitor agreed, returning the diary to the safe and locking it. But surely you can tell me what you suspect. All in good time, Poirot replied. For now, it is imperative that we speak with the administration at St. Mary's. And perhaps, he added with a significant glance in my direction, we shall discover why Mrs. Raines felt such a particular interest in Mr. Thomas Grant. The drive to London was accomplished mostly in silence, with Poirot deep in thought. Only as we approached the city did he finally speak. You observe the blueness of Miss Porter's lips, Hastings? Yes, quite similar to what Dr. Henderson described. Of Mrs. Raines. Précisément. And you noted what I recovered from beside the bench? I saw you pick up something, though I couldn't tell what it was. Poirot carefully unfolded his handkerchief, revealing a tiny glass vial with traces of white, powder still clinging to its interior. It would appear, mon ami, that someone at Oakenhurst has been dispensing a poison with rather specific symptoms. Now we must discover who and why Miss Porter was targeted. St. Mary's Orphanage was a solid Victorian institution in a respectable but modest neighborhood of East London. The matron, a formidable woman named Mrs. Bridges, received us in her office with an air of cautious cooperation. Thomas Grant, she repeated when Poirot inquired. Yes, of course I remember him. A good boy, quiet and studious, left us at 18 to join the army just before the war. And Mrs. Margaret Raines, Poirot continued, she was a benefactor. Of your institution, I believe. Indeed. One of our most generous supporters for over 20 years, Mrs. Bridges confirmed. Such a kind lady, taking a personal interest in our children. We were most distressed to learn of her passing. Did Mrs. Raines take a particular interest in Thomas Grant? Mrs. Bridges hesitated, glancing between us. I'm not at liberty to discuss the private arrangements of our benefactors, Mr. Poirot. Madame, Poirot said gravely, Mrs. Raines has been murdered, and I believe her death is connected to her interest in Mr. Grant. Your discretion, while admirable, may hamper justice. The matron paled visibly. Murdered? But the newspaper said... The newspaper was mistaken. Now, if you please, Mrs. Raines and Thomas Grant. Mrs. Bridges sighed heavily. Very well. Yes, Mrs. Raines took a special interest in Thomas from the time he was about 5 years old. She paid for extra tutoring, ensured he had proper clothes, books, everything a growing boy needs. But she was adamant that he never know the source of his good fortune. And did she ever explain why she took such an interest in this particular child? No, Mrs. Bridges replied. Though I always suspected... She trailed off, shaking her head. Yes? Poirot prompted gently. Well, there was something familiar about the boy's features, and the timing of his arrival here. But it was mere speculation on my part. When exactly did Thomas Grant arrive at St. Mary's? In the summer of 1896. He was left on our doorstep as an infant with nothing but a blanket and a small silver medallion. Poirot's eyes gleamed with interest. This medallion, do you still have it? It would have been given to Thomas when he left us, Mrs. Bridges explained. It was his only link to his origins. As we departed St. Mary's with a promise from Mrs. Bridges to search the records for any additional information, I could see that Poirot was deeply satisfied with what we had learned. The pieces begin to fit together, Hastings, he remarked, as our taxi carried us back toward the train station. Now we must find the missing will of Mrs. Raines. I believe it holds the final key to this mystery. Chapter 6. Testament of Truths. We returned to Oakenhurst as evening shadows lengthened across the grounds. The house seemed unnaturally quiet, as if holding its breath in anticipation of revelations to come. Perkins admitted us with his usual dignity, though I detected a new weariness in his manner. How is Miss Porter? Poirot inquired immediately. Somewhat improved, sir. Dr. Henderson has remained with her throughout the afternoon. He believes she will recover, though she remains weak. And the others? In the drawing room, sir. Mr. Weatherby suggested they remain together until your return. We found the assembled company in varying states of unease. Colonel Burrows paced before the fireplace, while Judith Raines sat rigidly in an armchair, her fingers drumming against its arm. Thomas Grant stood by the window, gazing out at the darkening gardens, and Mrs. Lacey hovered near the door, as if uncertain whether to stay or go. "Ah, Mr. Poirot," Weatherby greeted us, rising from his seat. "I trust your expedition was fruitful." "Most illuminating," Poirot replied. "But before we discuss our findings, I should like to know if there have been any developments here." "Nothing of significance," Weatherby began, but Colonel Burrows interrupted with a snort. "Nothing except the plain fact that we're being held prisoner in this house on the strength of your baseless accusations." "Not baseless, Colonel," Poirot replied, calmly. "Two women have been poisoned under this roof. One has died, the other narrowly escaped the same fate. These are facts, not accusations." "But who would want to harm Miss Porter?" Mrs. Lacey asked tremulously. "She's been with the household for so many years. Surely she couldn't have enemies." "Perhaps not enemies," Poirot suggested, "but she may have had knowledge that made her dangerous." A tense silence followed this observation. "Well," Colonel Burrows demanded, "did you learn anything useful in London, or was it merely a wild goose chase?" "We learned," said Poirot, seating himself, deliberately, that Mrs. Raines maintained a special interest in Mr. Grant from his childhood. She provided for his education and comfort throughout his years at St. Mary's Orphanage, though she arranged that he should never know the source of these benefits. All eyes turned to Thomas Grant, who had gone quite pale. I had no idea," he stammered. "There were additional funds for some of us, books, better clothing, tutoring, but we were told they came from anonymous benefactors. Why would Mrs. Raines take such an interest in me? I never met her before receiving that letter." "That," said Poirot, "is a question to which I believe we shall soon have an answer. Mr. Weatherby, might I trouble you to retrieve Mrs. Raines's diary from the safe?" As Weatherby left to comply, Judith Raines spoke up for the first time. "This is all very mysterious, Mr. Poirot. Are you suggesting that my cousin had some prior connection to Mr. Grant that none of us knew about?" "It would appear so, mademoiselle." "But what could possibly—" She broke off as Weatherby returned with the small leather-bound volume. "Before we examine this," Poirot said, taking the diary, "I have another matter to address. Mrs. Lacey, when last you served tea to Mrs. Raines, did you observe anything unusual about her cup or the tea itself?" The housekeeper looked startled. "No, sir, nothing out of the ordinary. I prepared the tray myself, as always. Mrs. Raines was most particular about her afternoon tea, and who had access to this tea before it was served. Well, I prepared it in the kitchen, then brought the tray up to Mrs. Raines's room myself. I suppose anyone might have entered the kitchen, but the tray was never out of my sight." "I see," murmured Poirot. "And today, who prepared Miss Porter's tea?" Mrs. Lacey frowned. "I didn't prepare any tea for Miss Porter this afternoon. In fact, I was coming to ask if she wanted some when I found her by the pond." "Most interesting," said Poirot. "So Miss Porter obtained tea from another source, or perhaps it was brought to her by her would-be murderer." He turned his attention to the diary, opening it carefully. The room fell silent as he scanned several pages. "Hastings," he said at last. Would you be so good as to check behind the third volume of Shakespeare's collected works in the library? I believe we may find something of interest there. Puzzled but obedient, I made my way to the library. The Shakespeare collection occupied a prominent position on the main shelves, and behind the third volume, just as Poirot had somehow divined, I discovered a sealed envelope. I returned to the drawing room and handed it to Poirot. Exactement, he said with satisfaction. Mrs. Raines has made reference in her diary to hiding important documents in her favorite books. It seems she did not entirely trust her safe. He carefully opened the envelope and extracted several sheets of paper, covered in a flowing handwriting. As he read, his eyebrows rose slightly. This, he announced, is the missing will. A collective intake of breath greeted this pronouncement. And, Colonel Burroughs demanded impatiently, it is as we suspected, quite different from her previous testament. Mrs. Raines has indeed named Mr. Thomas Grant as her primary heir. Oakenhurst is to pass to him, along with the bulk of her fortune. Thomas Grant sank slowly into a chair, his expression one of complete bewilderment. But why? He asked. Why would she leave everything to a stranger? Because, said Poirot gently, you were not a stranger to her, though you were unaware of the connection. He consulted the diary again. Mrs. Raines writes here of a great wrong she hoped to right, of a secret kept for far too long. What secret? Miss Raines asked sharply. This is absurd. My cousin barely knew this young man. On the contrary, replied Poirot, she knew him very well indeed, or rather, she knew who he was. Mr. Grant, did you possess a silver medallion given to you upon leaving the orphanage? Grant's hand moved unconsciously to his chest. Yes. I carry it still. It was found with me when I was left at St. Mary's as an infant. May I see it? With some reluctance, Grant withdrew a chain from beneath his shirt, on which hung a small silver medallion. He handed it to Poirot, who examined it closely before passing it to Weatherby. You recognize this, Mr. Weatherby? The solicitor adjusted his glasses, studying the medallion. Good heavens, he murmured. It's the Raines family crest. A stunned silence fell over the room. I believe, Poirot continued, that Mrs. Raines explains the situation quite clearly in her will. Mr. Weatherby, if you would be so good as to read the relevant passage. Weatherby cleared his throat and began to read. To Thomas Grant, whom I have watched over from afar these many years, I leave Oakenhurst and the majority of my estate. Thomas is the son of my late husband's brother, Richard Raines, and his wife, Eleanor. Both perished in a boating accident when Thomas was but an infant. Believing the child had also drowned, the family did not search for him. It was only years later that I discovered, through a chance remark by a former servant, that the child had, in fact, been rescued by a local fisherman who, not knowing his identity, left him at St. Mary's orphanage. Weatherby paused, adjusting his glasses. Upon confirming this information, I took steps to ensure Thomas's welfare anonymously, never finding the courage to reveal the truth to my husband or the rest of the family. It is my deepest regret that I allowed fear of scandal to prevent me from claiming him openly as our kin. I hope that this inheritance may, in some small way, atone for the years of family connection of which he was deprived. The revelation seemed to physically stagger Thomas Grant. I'm a Raines, he managed at last. Sir Richard Raines's son, to be precise, said Poirot. The medallion was likely placed with you by your mother before the accident as a way to identify you should you become separated, which indeed happened. This is preposterous, Colonel Burrows blustered, though with less conviction than before. There's no proof beyond this medallion and Margaret's word. On the contrary, said Poirot. Mrs. Raines commissioned a private investigation which confirmed the details through multiple sources. The documentation is included with the will. Judith Raines had gone very still, her face an unreadable mask. So I am not to inherit Oakenhurst after all, she said finally, her voice carefully controlled. No, mademoiselle, Poirot replied. Though Mrs. Raines has left you a generous bequest, the house passes to Mr. Grant as the rightful heir. I see, she said, rising smoothly. If you'll excuse me, I find I need some fresh air. As she left the room, Poirot's eyes followed her thoughtfully. Most interesting, he murmured. And now, ladies and gentlemen, I suggest we adjourn for dinner. It has been a most eventful day, and tomorrow promises to be equally illuminating. As the others filed out, Poirot held me back with a light touch on my arm. Observe carefully at dinner, mon ami, he said in a low voice. I have set a trap, and I believe our murderer may well reveal themselves tonight. With that cryptic statement, he followed the others to the dining room, leaving me to wonder what final act in this drama was about to unfold beneath the rafters of Oakenhurst. Chapter 7. The Orchestrated Malady. The dinner that evening at Oakenhurst was a curious affair. The revelation of Thomas Grant's true identity had cast a strange pall over the gathering. Grant himself appeared dazed, as if unable to fully comprehend his sudden transformation from orphan to heir. Colonel Burrows maintained a stony silence, breaking it only to request the salt or comment on the weather. Judith Raines had regained her composure but remained distant, her eyes occasionally darting to Grant with an expression I couldn't quite decipher. Mr. Weatherby made valiant attempts at conversation, while Mrs. Lacey, who had joined us at Poirot's insistence, seemed uncomfortable at finding herself elevated to the dining table rather than serving it. Dr. Henderson had come down briefly to report that Miss Porter was resting comfortably before joining us for the meal. Throughout the first two courses, Poirot remained unusually quiet, observing the company with his keen eyes while barely touching his food. It was not until the main course, a roast pheasant with seasonal vegetables, that he became more animated. Tell me, Dr. Henderson, he said, carefully selecting a morsel of pheasant. In your medical opinion, what type of poison was administered to Mrs. Raines and Miss Porter? The doctor looked startled at being addressed so directly. I couldn't say with absolute certainty without a proper toxicology report, but given the symptoms, the respiratory distress, the cyanosis, the rapid onset, I would suspect something in the cyanide family. Such poisons are not easily obtained, I believe, Poirot continued, reaching for his wineglass. No, not by the general public, the doctor admitted, but anyone with access to certain photographic chemicals or specific horticultural compounds might acquire them. How interesting, murmured Poirot, swirling the wine in his glass before taking a sip. I understand that photography is among your hobbies, is it not, Colonel Burrows? The colonel's head snapped up. What are you insinuating? Poirot is merely making conversation, mon ami, I interjected. One must explore all avenues in a murder investigation. Well, yes, I do dabble in photography, Burrows admitted grudgingly, but so do plenty of others. Miss Porter herself was quite the enthusiast in her younger days. Indeed? Poirot raised an eyebrow. One would not have expected it of such a retiring lady. Oh, she wasn't always so mousy, the colonel replied. Quite spirited in her youth, from what Margaret told me. Had ambitions of becoming a professional photographer before she took the companion position. Poirot nodded thoughtfully, then suddenly pressed a hand to his stomach with a grimace of pain. "Mr. Poirot." Weatherby looked concerned. "Are you unwell?" "It is nothing," Poirot replied, though his face had gone rather pale. "A momentary discomfort." He reached again for his wine glass but set it down untouched, another spasm of pain crossing his features. "Perhaps you should lie down," suggested Dr. Henderson, half rising from his chair. "Perhaps you are right," Poirot agreed. He attempted to stand but swayed alarmingly. "Hastings, if you would be so kind—" I hurried to his side, alarmed by the sudden perspiration on his brow and the tremor in his hands. Dr. Henderson was now fully alert. "Help me get him to his room," the doctor instructed. "These symptoms are concerning." Between us, we managed to support Poirot from the dining room and up the stairs to his chamber. Once the door was closed behind us, however, I was astounded to see Poirot straighten up, the tremor vanishing from his hands and the color returning to his face. "Poirot!" I exclaimed. "What on earth—" "Shh, mon ami," he cautioned, a finger to his lips. "Our murderer must believe their plan is working." He turned to Dr. Henderson. "You played your role admirably, Doctor. Now we must act quickly." The doctor nodded grimly. "What exactly are we looking for?" "Evidence of how the poison was administered," Poirot replied. "And I believe we will find it in Miss Porter's room. Hastings, remain here and make appropriate noises of distress should anyone approach. Doctor, come with me." Before I could protest, they had slipped out, leaving me alone in Poirot's room, feeling thoroughly foolish. Through the door, I could hear them moving quietly down the corridor toward Miss Porter's chambers. True to Poirot's prediction, within minutes there came a soft knock at the door. I hastily rumpled the bed and opened the door a crack to find Judith Rain standing outside, her face a mask of concern. "How is Mr. Poirot?" she inquired. "Dr. Henderson left in such a hurry." "Quite ill, I'm afraid," I replied, attempting to look worried. "The doctor believes it may be some form of food poisoning. He's gone to fetch some medication from his bag." "How dreadful," she murmured. "Is there anything I can do? Perhaps some tea might settle his stomach?" I recalled Poirot's warning about the tea at Oakenhurst and quickly declined. The doctor advised against anything by mouth for the moment. "But thank you for your concern." After she had gone, I waited anxiously for Poirot's return. Nearly 20 minutes passed before he and Dr. Henderson reappeared, the latter carrying a small leather case. "Success, Hastings," Poirot announced in a low voice. "We have found what we sought." He gestured to the doctor's case. "The evidence that will trap our killer." "But what exactly—" I began, only to be interrupted by a commotion in the corridor outside. "Come quickly." It was Mrs. Lacey's voice, high with alarm. "Miss Porter has disappeared from her room." We hurried out to find Mrs. Lacey wringing her hands in distress while Weatherby and Colonel Burrows emerged from their rooms to investigate the disturbance. "I went to check on her, and the bed was empty," Mrs. Lacey explained. "She can't have gone far in her condition." "We must search the house immediately," Poirot declared, his pretense of illness entirely abandoned. "Hastings, you and Colonel Burrows take the ground floor. Mr. Weatherby and Dr. Henderson search this floor thoroughly. Mrs. Lacey, please check the servants' quarters. I shall examine the attic spaces." As the search parties dispersed, I found myself accompanying a grim-faced Colonel Burrows through the darkened lower floor of Oakenhurst. "Damned peculiar business," he muttered as we checked the drawing room. "First, Poirot falls ill. Now Porter vanishes. Almost as if—" He broke off abruptly. As if what, Colonel? I prompted. Nothing. Just thinking aloud. He strode ahead toward the library, his manner suddenly brusque. We had searched the main rooms without success, and were about to check the conservatory when we heard Poirot's voice calling urgently from the direction of the kitchen. We hurried toward the sound, finding Poirot standing at the open door to the cellar, a hurricane lamp in his hand. "Listen," he commanded. In the silence, we could hear faint sounds from below. A scraping, dragging noise, then a muffled thump. "She's down there," said Poirot. "But I think she's not alone. Hastings, your revolver." I patted my pocket, relieved, to feel the familiar shape of my service revolver, which I had taken to carrying since our arrival at Oakenhurst. "Good. Colonel, I suggest you remain here. This may become dangerous." Burroughs bristled. "I am hardly an invalid, Poirot. I've faced worse than a cellar." "As you wish," Poirot conceded with a slight bow. "But stay behind us, if you please." The stone steps descended into darkness, broken only by the wavering light of Poirot's lamp. The cellar was extensive, divided into several chambers used for storage. The sounds grew louder as we approached the wine room, a separate chamber where Sir William Raines had maintained his considerable collection. Poirot paused at the entrance, raising the lamp higher. In its flickering light, we could make out a figure kneeling on the floor beside a prone form. Miss Porter, still in her nightclothes, apparently unconscious. "That is far enough," Poirot called out. "Step away from her, if you please." The figure froze, then slowly rose and turned toward us. The lamp illuminated Miss Evelyn Porter's face, her expression a curious mixture of resignation and defiance. "Miss Porter," I exclaimed in confusion. "But then, who—" "An old trick, but effective," said Poirot grimly. "The supposedly ill patient escapes while attention is diverted elsewhere. But I suspected the truth when I found certain items in your room, mademoiselle." The woman on the floor began to stir feebly. As she turned her face toward the light, I was astonished to recognize Judith Raines, bound and gagged with what appeared to be torn bedsheets. "It seems," Poirot continued calmly, "that you could not permit the truth about Thomas Grant to emerge, a truth that threatened to deprive you of what you had worked so long to obtain." Miss Porter's hand moved swiftly to her pocket, but Poirot was quicker. "I would not, mademoiselle," he warned. "Captain Hastings is an excellent shot, and the colonel, I believe, still maintains the reflexes of his military days." Slowly, reluctantly, her hand emerged empty. "You understand nothing," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "On the contrary," replied Poirot, "I understand everything, including why Margaret Raines had to die before she could announce Thomas Grant as her heir, and why you attempted to silence Miss Raines when she began to suspect the truth." The woman who had presented herself as Margaret Raines's loyal companion for over 20 years stood motionless in the cellar's chill, illuminated by the wavering lamplight, as the full extent of her deception began to unravel before our eyes. Chapter 8. The Denouement at Dusk. The drawing-room at Oakenhurst had never seemed more oppressive than it did the following evening. Outside, the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the garden and bathing the room in amber light that did little to dispel the tension within. At Poirot's request, everyone had assembled: Colonel Burroughs, Thomas Grant, Mr. Weatherby, Dr. Henderson, Mrs. Lacey, and a pale but recovered Judith Raines. Miss Porter sat apart from the others, her wrists bound, watched vigilantly by the local police inspector who had arrived that morning. Poirot stood before the fireplace, his diminutive figure somehow commanding the entire space. Following our Dramatic confrontation in the cellar. Miss Porter had been taken into custody, but she had maintained a stubborn silence, refusing to explain her actions or motives. Now it seemed the time had come for Poirot to unravel the final threads of the mystery. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "we are gathered to hear the truth about the death of Mrs. Margaret Raines, a death that was neither natural nor peaceful, but the result of cold-blooded murder. The facts, as we now know them, are these. Mrs. Raines discovered that Thomas Grant was, in fact, the son of her late husband's brother, thought to have perished as an infant. Having supported him anonymously throughout his childhood, she resolved to acknowledge him publicly and make him her heir. Before she could execute her new will, however, she was poisoned, a fate that nearly befell Miss Judith Raines as well." Poirot turned to face Miss Porter directly. "The murderer, as we have established, is Miss Evelyn Porter, Mrs. Raines's trusted companion of 23 years. But why?" Thomas Grant asked, his face troubled. "What possible motive could Miss Porter have had?" "A question most pertinent." Poirot nodded. "To understand the motive, we must look not forward to the inheritance, but backward, to the past. Miss Porter, would you care to enlighten us yourself?" Miss Porter raised her head, her expression defiant. "You seem to have all the answers. Mr. Poirot, why don't you tell them?" "Very well," Poirot agreed, beginning to pace slowly before the fireplace. "The story begins not 23 years ago, when Miss Porter entered Mrs. Raines's service, but nearly 30 years ago, with a boating accident that claimed the lives of Richard and Eleanor Raines. Or rather," he continued, his eyes fixed on Miss Porter, "an accident that was believed to have claimed 3 lives, those of the couple and their infant son. But as Mrs. Raines discovered recently, the child survived, rescued by a fisherman who left him at St. Mary's Orphanage. How Mrs. Raines made this discovery, we may never know with certainty. Perhaps a chance remark, as she suggested in her will, or perhaps her own investigations into the past. What matters is that she did discover it and resolved to make Thomas Grant her heir. But there was someone who could not allow this to happen. Someone who had cultivated a position of trust for over 2 decades with one goal in mind, to eventually inherit Oakenhurst and the Raines' fortune." Poirot turned to face the assembled company. "Miss Porter was not always Miss Porter. Before entering Mrs. Raines's service, she was known by another name, one that might have been recognized by those who knew the family history." "What are you suggesting?" Colonel Burroughs demanded, his brow furrowed. "I am suggesting, Colonel, that Miss Porter is in fact Eliza Tennant, first cousin to Eleanor Raines, and once governess to the Raines household. A woman who disappeared shortly after the boating accident that claimed the lives of Richard and Eleanor Raines." A collective gasp went up from the assembled company. Miss Porter's face remained impassive, though a slight tremor in her hands betrayed her agitation. "This information was contained in Mrs. Raines's diary," Poirot continued. "She had begun to suspect the truth about her companion's identity, but had not yet confronted her directly. The diary also revealed that Mrs. Raines believed the accident that killed Richard and Eleanor was no accident at all, but deliberate sabotage of their boat." "Good God!" breathed Weatherby. "Are you suggesting—" "I am suggesting," Poirot said gravely, "that Miss Porter, or rather, Miss Tennant, has been executing a plan 30 years in the making. First, to eliminate Richard and Eleanor Raines, believing their infant son had also perished, and that the path to the Raines' fortune would eventually be clear. Then, to ingratiate herself with Margaret Raines, becoming indispensable while waiting for her to die of natural causes. But when Mrs. Raines discovered the truth about Thomas Grant and prepared to change her will, Miss Porter realized her decades of patience would come to nothing. She administered poison to Mrs. Raines's evening tea, a poison derived from photographic chemicals, as Dr. Henderson suspected. When I began to investigate, and Miss Judith Raines appeared to be growing suspicious, Miss Porter attempted to eliminate her as well, first by poisoning her tea by the garden pond, then by attempting to stage what would have appeared to be a suicide in the cellar when the first attempt failed. Throughout this recitation, Miss Porter had remained silent, her gaze fixed on some middle distance. Now, at last, she spoke, her voice surprisingly steady. "You have no proof of any of this, Mr. Poirot. It's merely speculation." "On the contrary," Poirot replied, removing a small object from his pocket and placing it on the table. "This silver locket was found among your possessions. Inside is a photograph of Eleanor Raines, your cousin, and an inscription that reads, 'To Eliza, with love.' A sentimental keepsake you could not bear to part with, despite the danger it represented. Furthermore," he continued, "the poison vial discovered near the garden pond bears your fingerprints, and Mrs. Raines' diary contains her growing suspicions about your true identity, along with her intention to confront you after finalizing her new will." Miss Porter's composure finally cracked. "She had no right," she hissed, her eyes suddenly alive with fury. "The Raines' fortune should have come to me. Eleanor knew that. She promised me I would be provided for. But then she married Richard and had that child, and suddenly I was nothing but the poor relation, useful only as a governess." "The boating accident," I said quietly. "You arranged it?" "A faulty repair to the hull," she replied, a terrible pride in her voice. "So simple, really. And it would have worked perfectly if that interfering fisherman hadn't found the brat. For 30 years, I thought he had drowned with his parents, until Margaret made her grand announcement at dinner." She turned to Thomas Grant, who had gone deathly pale. "You should have died with them. Everything would have been mine eventually. I earned it. 23 years of pandering to Margaret's every whim, listening to her endless reminiscences, managing her correspondence, arranging her precious charitable works. And then you discovered her intentions regarding Mr. Grant," Poirot prompted. "She was giddy with excitement," Miss Porter said bitterly. "Couldn't wait to tell her precious nephew the truth. I tried to dissuade her, told her it would create a scandal, but she wouldn't listen. Always so righteous, so determined to do what she thought was right." "So you poisoned her," Dr. Henderson stated flatly. "It was merciful," Miss Porter replied. "In her sleep, just as everyone believed. No suffering, more than Richard and Eleanor got." Her gaze hardened as she looked at Judith Raines. "You were more troublesome. I didn't expect you to survive the first dose." Judith Raines shuddered visibly. "I saw you that afternoon," she said, "leaving Mrs. Raines's study with papers in your hand. You looked guilty. That's when I began to suspect something wasn't right." "A simple detail overlooked," Poirot nodded. "The flaw in an otherwise perfect plan. And then, when I began to investigate and discover the truth about Thomas Grant's identity, you realized you must act again." "I still don't understand, Thomas." Grant spoke up, his voice unsteady. "How did you know to look for me at all, Mr. Poirot? How did Mrs. Raines discover I was alive after all these years?" "That," said Poirot, "was perhaps the greatest irony of all. It was Miss Porter herself who unwittingly led Mrs. Raines to the truth." "What do you mean?" Grant asked. "The medallion you wore," Poirot explained. Mrs. Raines caught a glimpse of it when you were featured in a newspaper article about war veterans last year. She recognized the Raines family crest and began to investigate the possibility that you might be her husband's nephew, believed drowned as an infant. She kept the newspaper, added Weatherby. I found it among her personal papers. Your name was mentioned in the caption, which gave her the starting point for her inquiries. And so, Poirot concluded, a chain of events was set in motion that would ultimately expose a 30-year-old crime and bring justice at last to the Raines family. Miss Porter's face had gone blank, the rage draining away to leave nothing but a hollow exhaustion. As the police inspector stepped forward to escort her from the room, she paused to look at Thomas Grant one last time. "You have his eyes," she said flatly. "Richard's eyes. I should have known the moment I saw you." After she had been led away, a profound silence fell over the drawing room. It was Thomas Grant who finally broke it. "What happens now?" he asked, looking dazed. "Now," said Mr. Weatherby, adjusting his spectacles, "we proceed with executing Mrs. Raines's will. Oakenhurst is yours, Mr. Grant, along with the responsibilities and history that come with it." As twilight deepened outside the windows of Oakenhurst, I observed the varied expressions on the faces around me, Grant's bewilderment, Judith Raines's relief, the Colonel's grudging acceptance. A family saga 30 years in the making had reached its conclusion, and the great house had a new master. Later that evening, as Poirot and I prepared to depart for London, I found my friend standing at the window of his room, gazing out at the moonlit gardens. "A most satisfactory conclusion, would you not agree, Hastings?" he remarked. "Satisfactory but sad," I replied. "All those years of deception, and for what? Miss Porter, or Tennant, wasted her entire life on a scheme that was ultimately doomed to fail. Ah, mon ami, that is often the way with great crimes. The criminal becomes so fixated on the goal that they cannot see the flaws in their own design." He turned from the window with a small sigh. Mrs. Raines, for all her failure to acknowledge young Grant earlier, sought in the end to make amends. There is a lesson in that, perhaps. As we drove away from Oakenhurst the following morning, I glanced back at the stately home silhouetted against the autumn sky. Thomas Grant stood on the steps, a solitary figure at the threshold of his unexpected inheritance. The last will of Margaret Raines had finally been executed, bringing justice to the dead and a new beginning to the living. All, thanks to the little gray cells of my remarkable friend. Thanks for joining us for the last will of Margaret Raines. Were you able to piece together the connection between Thomas Grant and the Raines family before the will was discovered? If you enjoyed this adventure with Poirot and Hastings, don't forget to hit subscribe for more mysteries daily. Until next time, remember what Poirot often says. It's the little gray cells that matter, and the order and method in one's thinking that leads to the truth. This is Allie, signing off from Café Tales.